Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel, How to Tackle the New Wave of Nationalism and Illiberal Populism. This is a very big and important question, and so in order for us to be able to address this in this hour and 15 minutes of lunchtime panel, and also help you digest it while you digest your lunch at the same time, I would like to break this down into three sub-questions. So first of all, we have obviously already seen a rise in nationalism and in illiberal populism before the corona crisis hit. So what are actually these drivers of this new wave of illiberal populism and of nationalism? It has been linked to socioeconomic grievances, in particular after the financial crisis. It has been linked to an increasing relevance or salience, as we say in political science, of cultural issues, of identity issues, and also it has been linked to weaknesses of the established parties. And depending on the answer to that question, the progressive response could also look differently. So this is the first question. What are the drivers of this wave already before the crisis started? But now, of course, we are all gravely affected by the corona crisis. And the question is now, how does this actually affect this new wave of nationalism and illiberal populism? And we've already discussed some of these new developments might be beneficial for nationalists and populists, and others might actually harm them. And in our discussion now, I think we should try to disentangle these factors and think about which one is more likely to be relevant in the end. And because if you think about issues that might actually harm populists, we can think about that the performance of a lot of populist governments during the crisis was relatively bad. Thinking about the numbers that we see from the UK, from the US, also from northern Italy, where populists were in charge. Then secondly, of course, this is a time where expert science and governance matters in particular. And we've also seen opinion polls that trust in governments actually has been increasing. These are factors that might harm or dampen the rise of populists. On the other hand, there are also some issues that might be helpful for them, or in general for an illiberal and nationalistic agenda. First of all, we see increasing polarization in many countries between those that believe in the virus and those that question it. Second, we see a range of constraints on civil liberties during the crisis. Some of them might be legitimate, but are not seen as legitimate, and others might actually help illiberal governments purposefully to undermine democracy further, as we've seen in Hungary, for example. So these constraints of civil rights and liberties are something to discuss and their effects. And finally, of course, we might see, or we are certainly seeing, an increased economic and social crisis unfolding, and this might actually be something that populist nationalists might thrive on. So this is sort of some factors to discuss, to weigh now in the debate on how the corona crisis has actually affected this wave of nationalism and illiberal populism. And finally, the final, and I would say really the $1 million question, what should progressives do now and in the future to better counter the challenges of illiberal populists and of nationalists? And this is a very tricky but highly relevant question. So I'm very happy that I have such distinguished panelists here that will help us to address this question. First of all, maybe I should also introduce myself. My name is Anna Lührmann. I'm the Deputy Director of the Varieties of Democracy Institute at the University of Gothenburg and an Assistant Professor there as well. With me here today, we have Catherine de Vries, who is a Professor of Political Science at Bocconi University and a Research Associate at the Dondena Center for the Research on Social Dynamics and Public Policy. She is an expert on European politics, elections, and political parties. So we're very happy to have her here with us today. And then Matthew Goodwin also joined us, who is a British academic, professor of politics in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent, and also an associate fellow at Chatham House. I will ask them now for brief inputs on the topic, and then we'll follow up in a conversation. And finally, we will also address questions from the audience that you can submit via the platform that you're on at the moment. And we have to wrap up this panel at 1:15 today already, so that gives us a bit more than an hour to discuss these important questions. Now, Catherine, please, I'd like to hear what you have to say on this issue.
Great, Anna. Thank you so much. Also, thanks for Matthew to join as well, and for you guys all who are watching this. And I wanted to kind of take maybe a little bit of a step back to try to understand some of the questions that they are essentially about power and political power and how we organize that. And I think for that, we need to get a good understanding of how we do and how parties compete. So I just published a book together with Sarah Holbolt yesterday at Princeton University Press. So it's going to be also a little bit, Dutch people are known for self-marketing. So here, I'm Dutch by origin. I'm going to use that a little bit. But I wanted to first kind of start off with making the remark that before this crisis, populism was everywhere. And whatever adjective that we used to that, it was everywhere. It was all over the news. You couldn't open like from the FT to the Tageszeitung to the, whatever kind of media you read, from the Time to also many Japanese newspapers. So, but now it seems to be kind of nowhere except for where populists are in power, right? So we've kind of always, now the question is populism going to die? Is it going to be over? I would say that neither of those things, they make good headlines, but they're not really helpful for us to think about these questions, right? So I think we want to think a little bit about what is this recent rise of populist parties, and we can go along into how we define them. We'll just kind of, we know kind of the kind of parties we're thinking about on the left and the right spectrum, but to think a little bit about what is this a case of? So what's this a phenomenon of, or how can we understand it? And in the book that Sarah Holbolt and I outline, we think about political change, or how change comes about in politics, or within the party system to be more precise. We think of that as a tug of war between dominant parties that want to protect their market power and political entrepreneurs, which we call challenger parties, that want to innovate, right? So it's almost in the way that Schumpeter thinks about how economic change comes out with firms. It's the same kind of powers, right? So dominance and innovation. So populist parties are in our typology seen as a challenger party. So challenger parties we define as those who have not been in government, who are not in government, or have not been in government in the most kind of recent past. And they often lack government experience altogether. And they want to disrupt the dominance of mainstream parties. So we have to understand that also what a lot of populist parties do is strategy. Not all of it. I'm just giving you an example. Matteo Salvini and Lega in Italy was a Eurosceptic party. It's now favoring Eurobonds, one of the most political integrative instruments. So that shows you that the way that they deal with a lot of things is also instrumental. I think there's also some key underlying patterns, and and Matthew has done amazing work on that. But we also need to think about populists as an example of kind of strategic entrepreneurs. And if you haven't been able to control policy, or you've been in government, some have, but the majority of them haven't, it's about the struggle of getting a better position in the marketplace. And our book has very much been about what is a successful strategy to employ. So how can we understand the success of these type of parties when they do it? And we suggest that two things they really try to do. So they try to introduce an issue that's not easily linked to traditional dimensions of competition. Often those are left-right, right? So more state intervention in the economy. So things like immigration, also the environment for green parties, right? Also European integration. So we don't only see this kind of political entrepreneurship of this is the second point, of populist parties, but also of progressives, right? Of green parties, of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, like these type of kind of entrepreneurs. So it's not just a populism, it's about trying to bring something new and break open that status quo. So the second thing they do not only is to introduce that what we call issue entrepreneurship, this wedge issue that doesn't fit so well, but secondly, they also want to attack the competence of governments. Because in order for them to make sure that governments don't co-opt their innovation, don't also start talking about immigration or European integration or green issues. They try to say, you know, guys, we are the real one. The other guys are the copycats, right? So they try to, but it's really important to understand that this is not only something that populist parties do. It also is important to understand that this is not often a long-lasting link to some constituency. You know, people, you know, populist parties come and go, then can come and go very, very, very easily. But there's also ways in which mainstream parties can deal with that. The number one issue, I think, where we see a lot of illiberalism is perhaps not necessarily the challenge of populist parties. We see those in many systems, but the response of dominant parties. So where dominant parties start to co-opt, especially on the center right, a lot of the issues that populists put forward because they see the electoral success and they want to mimic it, we can see gradual shifts away, or some people would call that, maybe someone like Ziblatt would call that some form of democratic backsliding. That what we're doing is we're actually not protecting liberal rights. We're taking up a lot of the issues kind of gradually. It's like a fish in the water, and you put up the heat of the water, right? At a certain point, we realize, oh wow. So, and that's not just, it takes two to tango. That's not just something that populist parties put forward, not all of them, but some of them on the right do, or on the left. We see that also with populist parties on the left being quite illiberal. And then the key element is how mainstream parties respond. And I think in this particular crisis, to come back to the crisis, has been really interesting. So I'm just giving you the example of Dutch parliament, where the Dutch health minister introduced a bill that constitutional lawyers said was largely illiberal. At the same time, the Dutch government is spouting their correct critique, perhaps, of Orban, but it is implementing actually quite some issues where constitutional lawyers are like, whoa, wait a minute, this is really going too far when it comes to our liberal rights. So it's very important to think not just about populist parties and their entrepreneurship and their political entrepreneurs, but also how dominant parties try to respond. And I think one last element I wanted to highlight is maybe what we can think about the crisis, and I will end on that. So at this moment in time, I said it already before, we said, well, populist parties are not necessarily on the agenda because a lot of the things that we're talking about are about left-right politics, the domain of dominant parties, right? So how do we introduce, how do we create more money for health? How do we get a recovery fund? A lot of these kind of elements that we talked about. But it doesn't, this first kind of rally around the flag and the crisis that people want governments to deliver doesn't mean that now populists are going to be salient. There will be a lot of room for political entrepreneurs when we go into a phase, kind of the second phase of the crisis, which will have to do with social inequality, which will have to do with large economic crisis, and the cost of the initial health crisis economically will become clear. And a lot of the evidence that we suggest, that we also present in the book, but that other economic historians have outlined, is that that's a useful instrument again for let's say for political entrepreneurs to mobilize new issues such as immigration again, or well, new issues, but like other issues, and we talk about immigration or fair distribution of gains, or etc., and then actually capitalize on that again. So the way I think we have to understand is that what we've seen in the last period is not necessarily new. It's a way that dominant parties and entrepreneurs interact and try to fight over power and who's in power. And we cannot just expect that now we're going from one to the other edge of the spectrum. It's going to be an continuing struggle. And I think throughout the conversation, I can kind of allude also a little bit more what perhaps could be a different way than what we've seen in the past, that mainstream parties, not just progressives, but maybe also the center right, would have to respond in order to kind of protect some of the liberal democracy and some of the achievements that we've outlined. So those were the points. So I think populism, either them being everywhere or being nowhere, that's not a useful framework. We have to understand them as being kind of normalized in the system. These are entrepreneurs that have an incentive to mobilize certain issues, to engage in anti-establishment rhetoric. And what is key is also how mainstream parties respond. And we probably have to understand this as the kind of initial health crisis, where we saw a lot of rallying around the flag and kind of popularity of governments, which I also show in some of my recent work. But that doesn't mean that in the long haul, we're not going to see quite a potential very fruitful ground again for political entrepreneurs, both on the left and on the right. And we're going to be back in a lot of the discussions that we've had previously. So those, I think, were the kind of first points I wanted to make. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. I will we'll come back to some of those questions later. Matthew now, please.
Thank you for inviting me along. Thank you to Catherine for those opening thoughts. Thank you to Anna for moderating the discussion, and thank you to the participants for joining. There's obviously a lot going on in 2020. As somebody said on Twitter last week, when we come to the future, our historians will have to say what quarter of 2020 they specialized in, because there's just so much going on. I think where I wanted to start really is looking at the opposite side to Catherine. Catherine started by talking hopefully about top-down processes and how party competition has played into what we're dealing with today. And I'd like to look at bottom-up changes within society. And I was reminded shortly before this session that you can trace this conference back to 2002. And I think I was actually at that conference with my PhD supervisor. And of course, we forget this now, but that was also a big year for populism. That was the year that Jean-Marie Le Pen made it through to the final round against Jacques Chirac. And the globe had there was a big global debate about populism. So I think firstly, we need to remember just how long-term this challenge has been. And we need to be skeptical of arguments that suggest that the root causes can be found within the immediate short-term landscape. So in my mind, at least, and certainly the argument that Roger Eatwell and I set out in our book, National Populism, is that this is a family of parties that has consolidated. And it's a family of parties that is unlikely to disappear in the short term. There may be, in particular, election results. Donald Trump might lose the election in November. Matteo Salvini might perform poorly at the next election in Italy. Macron might win again in France. But in very broad terms, as a family of parties that emphasize a number of similar issues, I don't think national populism will disappear from our landscape. I think it's here permanently. And that's because of how we are in the process of a secular realignment in our politics. And we are all witnessing the emergence of new dividing lines in our politics, which I think most political scientists would share a consensus that this has been coming really since the 1980s and 1990s. It's reflected in work by people like Russell Dalton and Hans-Peter Creasy that have pointed out that the traditional dimension of politics, left versus right, is not disappearing, but it is being joined by a second dimension between liberal and conservatives, or some might argue liberal and authoritarians. And that's become especially problematic for progressives because new identity and cultural issues like migration, the refugee crisis, issues around even gender, diversity, Islam are becoming more salient to voters. And those are issues that do not fall neatly into transactional debates about economic power. They relate much more closely to our values. And on the liberal end, we've seen Green parties prosper from that, and we've seen radical left parties prosper. But on the other end, we've seen national populists really bring together a very coherent electorate. Blue-collar workers, people without university degrees, and traditional social conservatives. And they have found something of an alliance, principally around their values, not their economic experience. So if you kind of accept that key point that what we're dealing with is a permanent realignment in politics, and conservatives, as Catherine said, might be able to fend off parts of that revolt by co-opting some of those issues, as we've seen in Britain, for example. But I don't think the underlying public demand for a national populist message that says that people should have more control over the decisions that affect their daily lives, that we should have less immigration, and that we should push back against rapid social change. I don't think any of that will disappear in the short term. And there are four key things I would like to try and get us to think about. The first, with regards to that underlying demand, is public distrust of established politics. And we just, we're already talking about this concept of power, but there are many groups within society that have very little democratic power. And our debate about diversity has focused overwhelmingly on gender and race. it hasn't really discussed in a meaningful way social class. And that has been deeply problematic because many of the groups that have been turning to populist parties, for example, non-graduates and blue-collar workers, are much less represented in our national parliaments. They feel that they do not have a voice over the decisions that affect their daily lives. And they do not feel that they're represented in progressive liberal parties because largely they're not. And as a consequence, they are leaving the mainstream, as we've seen here in the UK, where the Labour Party has been completely transformed over the last 3 decades. And the Conservative Party is now the most popular party by a long way among the working class. The second key point for me is deprivation, but not objective deprivation. It's relative deprivation, that we have a large number of voters who are comparing their economic experience to the experience of others. And that is especially significant when it comes to populism for working class men. As we know, there's usually a strong gender gap in their support. And whether you look at this issue from the right, as people like Charles Murray have done, or whether you look at it from the left, as people like Angus Deaton and Robert Putnam and Peter Hall have done, we need to have a much more serious debate about the failings of meritocracy within our society. And this debate in the UK has been coming for a long time, can be traced back to the work of Michael Young and others. But we know that social mobility is actually not as open as it should, is not working as it should be for certain groups within society, and that is fueling a sense of status loss, a lack of recognition, and a lack of dignity for certain groups. And as Bobby Kennedy reminded us in 1968, there are lots of things that GDP does not take account of, and one of those things is dignity. And there are lots of voters today that feel that they don't have any dignity, and they're not given the same status that university educated social liberals are within wider society. Thirdly, we need to think about whether we can strike a compromise on this very potent issue of immigration. It's less of an issue in some EU states than it has been in places like the United States and United Kingdom. But we do need to think about what that compromise might look like. There are examples in history. For example, the United States, which in the first few decades of the 20th century sought to reduce the overall level of migration in order to foster better integration and then gradually increased levels of migration. I think there are some European states that might want to look at that model, for the simple reason being that we have 30 years of research on national populism, which shows pretty clearly that the primary driver of support for these parties is concern over that issue. And we can navigate that and we can present it in different ways and we can try and avoid it. But the reality is that we have a large number of voters that still feel very anxious about migration and its effects on their societies. And just lastly, before we come to discussion, even if you think everything I've said until this point is nonsense, one of the realities that we all face as political scientists, as political analysts, as activists, is that our party systems are de-aligning, that we just don't have the levels of loyalty, of the levels of habitual voting that we used to have. And as consumers are moving away from those loyal beginnings and becoming more like consumers and picking and choosing, the reality is our politics will remain much more volatile as we go forward. So political parties, mainstream parties, are going to have to fight even harder to try and win over voters, because they're not going to be able to rely on many of those traditional loyalties, like the power of social class, for example, that they were once able to do. So my sort of core message, Anna, before we just go to discussion is, I think we need to be very realistic. I think we need to be very, we need to accept that some of the fundamentals here are very deep rooted and that they're not going to change by a particular campaign or a particular message. And we need to work harder and think harder about whether actually there can be a compromise on certain issues. Otherwise, I fear the end result will just be more polarization as you get these value tribes moving further off from one another. But we can take that into discussion.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. Catherine, I would like to ask you some questions to what Matthew, or to comment on what Matthew just said. So basically, you, in your introductory remarks, you pointed out that you mainly see sort of the rise of challenger parties being a consequence of the weaknesses of mainstream parties. But what exactly are these weaknesses? So sort of Matthew seems to suggest now that the weakness could be that they don't address the second dimension in the party system well, the cultural dimension. On the other hand, Matthew has also pointed out that class issues, which is actually like a first dimension issue, I would say, something about income, that also makes people unhappy and pushes them into the arms of challenger parties, to use your term here. So what's your sense? Could you like maybe go into a bit more detail here? What are these factors that weaken mainstream parties, and what could they do to better address them?
Sure. So I think what's really important that, of course, there needs to be demand, right? So, and I think Matthew has outlined that, and there is also other periods of demand in history before. So I think the question then becomes that we try to address, why now? So why did the populists come up right now? And then secondly, why do we see so many differences? So Sarah is originally born Danish, I'm born Dutch. So the major overhaul of the party system in Denmark was in the 70s. It's even longer, right? So the first kind of populist birth. And in the Netherlands was only in the early 2000s. So why are two countries that are very culturally similar, that are very in their institutional structures, why do we see these differences? So we do think that there's like a key role to play for entrepreneurs and the strategies that they employ, and I will try to outline this. So you asked me about, so I talked already about what can these challenger parties do, or these political entrepreneurs do in order to be successful. But I think there's three strategies that the dominant parties employ in order to remain dominant. So one is that they have the institutions behind them, right? The institutions were crafted by the dominant parties, so they favor the dominant parties. I.e., think in the United Kingdom, we had a Brexit realignment on with the Conservatives, but that happened within the party because the electoral system is not permissive enough for new parties to come up. In the Netherlands, it's a fundamentally different story because we have very permissive electoral rules. So you see very high levels of fragmentation. So the level playing field is different within different countries. So therefore you can see sometimes that in the United Kingdom and in the United States, why is it now kind of happened later, but much with like a larger vengeance, if you will, it came harder, and that's because it happened within the mainstream party, and that of course will have effect on all kinds of policy. While in many continental European parties, it was be within a coalition. Then what are the key things that you said, I think about so that's the institutional backup, right? So we have the demand, we have some institutions that are more or less permissive. But I think the three things that mainstream parties do that are their strength and their weakness at the same time are that they try to be like what one would say in German, Volksparteien. Center right, center left. So go to the middle, this kind of economic problem, the ice cream vendor on the beach, how do you maximize your vote share? Well, to, be in the middle of where the voters are. But the problem is that over time, especially in the third way, that voters didn't see a choice anymore. It was truly die and truly dumb. So you had center right, center left. You could just kind of exchange them respectively because the core element on their debate, left right, was quote unquote settled in the third way. I don't think it was ever settled, but that was at least the image that many people came. So it allows them to control the marketplace because they are able to attract as many flavors, but it also can become a bland flavor that no one really likes. And secondly, what they do is they avoid issues that hurt them. So these wedge issues that Matthew was talking about, they don't want to talk about immigration. They don't want to talk about European integration, not about the environment, because their constituency is split. But of course, if you then have an external event, like in the Netherlands, 9/11, that was then taken up and we had terrorist attacks in the Netherlands, you cannot avoid the issue anymore. So you have to start talking about it, but then the challenger party has already kind of innovated way ahead and you seem like you're always lagging behind, right? As if the kind of the electric car company and Ford needs to respond. Right? In that kind of analogy. And then the third thing, what challenger parties do is they try to say, these guys can't govern, but we can, right? So we're the competence thing. But that's crucial. Taking of the country that I live now, So when in Italy, you saw the total collapse of the party system in 1992 or 1994 when the election happened. Why was that? The Clean Hands campaign, that all kinds of corruption within Italian parties. The same happened during the Greek crisis. These parties were replaced by challengers because these parties were talking about competence only, and then they got the key signal voters that, oh, well, these guys are not competent at all. They are actually corrupt, they are whatever, right? So you see this, you don't see that, so you've seen that primarily in Italy and Greece. It doesn't happen very often that mainstream parties get replaced. But I think this competence mobilization only works when you are perceived competent. And I think that is the key element that Matthew was also talking about. If you start talking about meritocracy, that people think that actually you're lying, i.e. you're not doing that, you get this kind of confidence gap. So I think these three things, so mobilizing competence, which has to be credible. Secondly, being in the center, which gets the most flavors, but sometimes can make you look bland. And thirdly, avoiding issues. But then when kind of external events happen, it's very difficult to avoid an issue. So I think those are the kind of strategic dilemmas that mainstream parties kind of face. Right.
But Matthew, if I understood you correctly, your advice would rather be to actually tackle those wedge issues, and particularly also the issue of immigration from the side of, let's say, mainstream parties, progressive mainstream parties, to find some sort of consensus here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a silver lining to populism, and certainly in the academic literature, there's always been a less popular argument, if you like, but there has been an argument going back to, I mean, it's Michael Oakeshott and others really, that when you have challengers and you have new insurgents, that they do and can make politics more responsive to ordinary citizens. And the question for progressives is, you know, voters are sort of holding out this, this offer. And the question is whether you're going to have a conversation with them about it. And the instinctive reaction, certainly among many activists, is clearly that compromise is being an apologist for populism. To me, that's an unsustainable position, because it's no coincidence that as these parties have risen, social democracy in general has had probably the worst 2 decades really since social democracy emerged as an ideology. And I'm talking in very general terms. I mean, you can point to countries like Spain and a few others and say, well, some of the trends don't match up with that. But in general terms, the first 2 decades of the 21st century have not been good ones for social democracy, especially since 2005. And I think underlying this, and I'm sort of won over partly by what Catherine says, because we know that in politics, there's always this tension between the pragmatic side and the redemptive side, you know, and this was a classic Oakeshott view, that the problem with many mainstream parties is that they become too pragmatic, they become too dry, they become too transactional, and they reduce politics to a series of managerial debates about costs and benefits. And we saw this run through the Brexit campaign. It was one of the reasons that Remain lost, that most people do not live their lives according to GDP. And every time that you try and reduce political arguments to that economic equation, you're simply going to leave yourself open to attack from
if I may interrupt you here, at the same time, you were saying that it is a challenge or a problem that Labour, for example, doesn't address class issues as much. So what is class issues?
Yes, if I just get, but on the other side, you know, if you've got pragmatists and technocrats on one side, you know, Peter Mayer talked about the European Union fulfilling lots of criteria with regard to democratic institutions, but he also made the point that you can't have true oppositional politics at the European Union level. And I think partly what we've entered into more generally is an era in which citizens are questioning whether their institutions are as accountable and transparent as they should be. And I think the crisis will exacerbate this. The big winner of COVID-19 in many ways has been the nation state. The nation state has been the primary point of organization that people have looked to. It's been national leaders that first did particularly well in the polls. And so I think all of this is, and I am sort of being slightly provocative because we're here to have a debate, but all of this really raises the question around whether progressives are really going to now seriously interrogate what they can do to change the system. So here's one example with regards to that class issue, okay? nobody's saying economics doesn't matter. Economics matters, but so does culture. And it's about how they interplay, right? And we need to think about how they interplay. So one example might be, how can we magnify the voice of the groups that are voting for populist parties within mainstream structures, right? How can we do that? Because we're talking a lot about getting some groups into national legislatures, but we're not talking so much about getting other groups into national legislatures. And that's a problem, because those groups are then leaving the mainstream and saying, well, what's the point in participating? And I think that's something that could be really, really meaningful. And secondly, you know, on economic reforms, let's say, well, let's leave the debate about is it economics, is it culture for a second, but on economic reforms, how can we do a lot more to push back against the fact that the overall share of national income across much of Europe going to workers has been declining for 3 or 4 decades? Because when those workers are saying, actually, this system isn't particularly fair for me, I don't, you know, I'm not getting my fair share, all of which, by the way, will be magnified by this current crisis, because it's those same groups that are getting hit the hardest by COVID-19. It's the same groups that are getting laid off at work and are more likely to suffer the health effects. You know, we're going to need more radical economic interventions on the back of this. And that's going to need to go way further than, you know, deliberative democracy. It's going to have to get into serious, substantial economic reform to push back some of the undercurrents that have been eroding workers' position within societies. And so I think progressives, unfortunately, in my mind, have gone too far on the cultural axis and have sort of left a lot of the economic questions behind them. I think we need to rebalance that formula, because otherwise, you know, the one thing we are also seeing is national populists themselves are beginning to change their economic position. They're beginning to become more protectionist. They're beginning to become more economically nationalist. You can see that, for example, in what Marine Le Pen has been saying about multinational corporations. That's a bit of a challenge to the progressive left that's coming down the line, because usually we've only had to think about tackling populism through issues like migration. But if they're now going to start turning up the volume on economics, that could be deeply problematic for liberal progressives if they're not also talking as loudly about those reforms as they are about identity and those sorts of issues.
Great. So Catherine, maybe you also have some thoughts on what Matthew just said, and then also maybe you can take into account a question that we got from the audience about how can progressive parties introduce this energy inside their own party structures? So sort of, I assume sort of also the energy that potentially challenger parties have at a moment where also, as Matthew pointed out earlier, party affiliation is collapsing. Like, you know, we all know, we've all discussed about this since Peter Meyer and others. Here this question from the audience raises another point, that most of the structures of parties with access to power are co-opted for governmental institutional positions. So it's actually the focus of a lot of the human resources in a party are focusing on ruling. Actually, it's probably maybe also some issue that we see with the CDU in Germany at the moment.
Exactly. So I think that Matthew makes very valuable points. We might have slightly different ideas about how we reinvent ourselves. I think that I am a bit wary about starting to talk like a populist, because you're going to lose the game. Like, you have to play your own game. So the question is, what's your own game? And I think you can actually be way more. I mean, Angela Merkel saying the era of the nation state is over, right? So you can. The way that Angela Merkel has been able to reshape the debate on debt mutualization can go into the history books. If it will last is a totally different story, right? But like, it doesn't mean, so the idea that only populists can sway public opinion is just simply wrong. There is no evidence to suggest that they're better. Actually, for the centrist, if we do experiments with source credibility, for a lot of centrist voters, adding a populist on the side is not beneficial. So the problem is that a lot of centrist right parties start looking and sounding like a populist. fine by me if that's the kind of, you know, position you want to take. It's not personally my position, because I think that there are some systemic things we want to address. So that's kind of the first thing. But we might differ on that. I think Matt and I do agree on the sense that you have to get the game back. But I think the elements of what you were describing. So there's a couple of things that are really tricky. So populists have really mobilized people into the system, which is great, as Matthew was also referring to. The only thing is that people are not happy in that system necessarily. We show also in the book, people are more engaged, they feel more represented, but they don't necessarily feel that the system is so good. And I think the element that is linking to that is a core element that Peter Mayer has put forward, is what are we governing for, right? So if you get, I'm just going to take someone from the German debate, Gerhard Schröder, who has set his entire debate about like left-wing politics and then goes into Gazprom. I'm sorry, but how does that link up? So Zapatero is a very good example in Spain, that he's refused to take any position, right? He's just living in a kind of humble house, advises Pedro Sanchez, that's what he's doing. So the degree to which politicians are living out what they're doing, that is also partly. Matteo Salvini, you might have all kinds of ideas of him. He goes to the beaches. He meets people. He's not afraid to go and have exercises. And this idea of a managerial class, I very much agree with Matthew on that. The managerial class is not in touch. The question is, what do we want to be in touch about? Well, we can have different ideas about what center-right and center-left should be putting forward. But the idea that you run into politics in order to, as a kind of carousel for a job afterwards, that has been very, very harmful. And we know that from a lot of research. So I think that it's, you know, the one thing I think that carves out. So I'm just going to give you another example of a country. I mean, my husband is Spanish, so I know the Spanish situation quite well. So Pedro Sanchez, when he was given the possibility to become the leader, he was not favored by the party. He went in a very small car, drove around Spain, and met everyone. He won the primary, right? Just by putting in the shoe leather, right? Working for it. That has given him a credibility. Now he also needs to move into like a government phase. So the question is, how can you seem authentic and seem that you really care while managing at the same time? A lot of populists don't necessarily have to do that difficulty because they're often not in government, right? So I think that's also a crucial element. How can you reinvigorate that debate? It's partly also by not following necessarily the structures, but then you have to do like, you know, you have to go around primaries. So certain parties might be better to able to do that. But I think a lot of it is also about the fact that people want to be represented, but they often feel that the structures that are in place and the way that actors act within those structures are not quote unquote authentic. And the question is, how can we deal with that?
Can I ask a quick question, Anna, just briefly? We have to try and avoid presenting the issue of addressing voters' concerns as sounding like a populist, okay? Because that is a cul-de-sac, right? That is going to lead us nowhere. And this is where I think there's a book by Mark Blyth and Eric Lonergan, which is very interesting. And they make the point that if you want to be responsible in politics, you have to draw a distinction between primitive anger, that is basically outburst politics, that is irrational, can be xenophobic, can at times be openly racist. But then you can also be witnessing moral outrage, which has a legitimate grievance behind it. Here's where I get nervous. When voters are saying clearly they feel morally outraged by issue ABC, whether that's about corporations, whether it's about inequality, whether it's about the pace of social change without being consulted on it. We cannot then respond to that by saying, well, if we talk about these issues, we're going to sound like a populist, so we better not actually engage with these issues, because that is not a viable political strategy whatsoever. So let me give you a real world example, seeing as I've already heard the UK government being described as populist, which personally I don't think it is. Boris Johnson is a very is basically a conservative liberal. In fact, he's too liberal for many of the Brexit voters that are now following him. But let me give you a real world example. And this is very Anglo-Saxon, and I'm sure Catherine will have thoughts from elsewhere in Europe. Britain votes for Brexit, and whatever your view of Brexit, that's essentially what the public asked for. The government then under Boris Johnson comes in and says, well, clearly one of the big reasons why we entered into this discussion was public concern over immigration. So let's reform migration. That is a great test case example of where progressives should have led that debate and said, okay, in essence, the public has made a decision about Britain's relationship with Europe, but here's an opportunity to redefine the debate over migration reform that would make it as progressive as possible. So how do we do that? Okay, maybe we could push for a system that gives much greater preference to National Health Service workers, to international students, to, you know, however you might interpret a progressive migration policy outside of the European Union. Progressives could have led that debate, and they could have said, okay, we accept that on this particular issue of Brexit, there's been a defeat, but let's compromise with voters and let's try and ensure that the new reality is as progressive as possible. And I think we need to start looking at these test cases and these case studies to try and figure out where is that point of compromise? And that's not sounding populist. That's making a compromise, which is what politics is about. Politics is about bargaining. It's about consensus, and it's about meeting in the middle. And what worries me when I look at many activists today is this complete and utter refusal to compromise, to even enter into a discussion because you're a populist apologist, or you're sounding like the other side, and that's not viable. That's not going to get us anywhere toward building a solution.
So can I say one thing? So I agree with that partly, but also I disagree with one crucial point. So the way that I think about populists there is the way Riker thought about populists, which is basically that I think that what we see in the preferences of people, oftentimes we don't see that people's positions on immigration change. Actually, in the United Kingdom right now, the majority of people are way more progressive on immigration than they were. The issue is what the salience of that issue is, what the importance of that issue is. And I think the idea that there is some thing that we need to react to because the entire population has walked around from us is what Salvini wants often people to think about, you know, like talking about 2,000 votes, except that there were only 2 in real life. So the idea, I think, is that a lot of what we see in public opinion, and I've done majority of work on that, it's that public opinion is not some exogenous thing. It's shaped by political parties, but it's shaped in both ways. And I think if you have a populist, and then using the kind of Cosmud idea of populism, so the kind of populist as a party family, especially on the right, which has talked very much about immigration, we know that that was also, you know, we know that many British people early on in let's say the early 2000s didn't particularly care much about immigration, even at the time when immigration was at a very high level. But when parties talked about that, so if parties would have picked another issue, they might have also cared about another issue. I don't think that it's that, so there's clearly a demand, but the way that what we see in opinion polling is also shaped by supply. So if we know that we can shape supply, shape demand also primarily, it's changed the priorities that people use when they think about it. And I share the idea about, you know, values and all these things. I don't see these things as different. You know, a lot of people who are suffering the most from the crisis are of an ethnic minority, right? So especially in the United Kingdom, actually. So in that way, you know, these debates are very intersectional, but I think that parties need to understand that it's also about agenda setting. And what I think that Matthew and I very much agree on, that this idea of being a cartel, of just using managerial skills and campaigning on managerial skills, that doesn't cut it. It's like, what do you want? Do you want a sticker that you've been so good in government? I mean, I don't care. I want to know what you have to say. But I think to react, so the way what I was referring to, Matthew, so I think we agree, but the idea of just responding to the public, we don't often know what the public always wants on every issue. And it's very cross-cutting, and they're trade-offs. And political parties have to give programs that shape these trade-offs and that give clear answers on that, and need to start being agenda setting, because you know, the populist left and the populist right are very agenda setting. They know exactly what they want. Exactly. I think oftentimes that the kind of mainstream parties do not know exactly what they want.
Right. And about agenda setting, we actually have 2 questions from the audience that I'd like to put forward. Because I mean, setting agendas is a lot about values and standards. So we have one question here. What values and standards and institutional architecture, so would you critically recommend, especially regarding the international sphere? Here, maybe something, Matthew, for you to think about, because you mentioned that you think now the Corona crisis has actually emphasized the national realm again. And then maybe we'll connect this with another question where somebody writes that in the context of national populism, what reflections do you have on how and in what kinds of context people reinterpret values and even adopt different values to the processes of moral learning? And dignity is another issue that you mentioned, Matthew, is a good example here. Having moved from dignity as honor or status to dignity as equality of human status. So Matthew, do you want to take these sort of the set of like, what kind of agenda is there to set?
Well, I think obviously at the moment we're at a somewhat unique watershed moment where there is going to be an agenda to be set. I think, you know, it's always difficult to guesstimate what the effects of a crisis will be. But if you go back to the previous crisis and the Great Recession, it would be difficult, for example, knowing everything that we know today, to predict what the effects of that crisis would be in the aftermath of the collapse of Lehman Brothers. But now, with more than 10 years of experience, we can see what the effect of the Great Recession was politically. We can see that it fed into greater fragmentation. We can see that it provided a backdrop to some pretty big moments of political volatility. We can see that it led to an erosion of public trust, particularly in parts of Southern Europe. And we can see that the big winner of the 2010s was not really social democracy and left parties that might otherwise have been expected to benefit from economic crisis and economic scarcity. That, to me, is a canary in the coal mine for the 2020s, which is don't fall into the trap of thinking that the what is now a triple crisis, which is health, economics, and soon to be, I think, political, that this will automatically benefit certain family parties. I think, as Catherine said, it's going to be messy and it's going to be volatile, but it is also going to be an agenda in which many of those classic questions around inequality, wealth, and redistribution come back with a vengeance. For example, I've just finished reading a paper on the effects of pandemics in the past, and it concludes that overall, pandemics tend to lead to a statistically significant increase in the Gini coefficient in inequality. So I think we have some tentative evidence to perhaps suggest that we're likely to see some of the divides that have taken root over the last 2 or 3 decades be exacerbated. I think there's an opportunity for progressives in that. I think if they can frame why they need to go further than the past to deliver economic reforms and to deliver radical measures to tackle that, I think that could be of interest. But it comes with a risk too, because we know that national populists will try and merge those issues of economic insecurity with cultural insecurity, and that potentially is a problem. We also know that we're going to come out of this crisis with a much bigger state, and that the relationship between the citizen and the state is going to be very different from what the relationship between the citizen and the state was in years gone by. And I think when you put the Great Recession together with the Great Lockdown, the end result is we're going to have governments that are bigger, that are more interventionist, that in some ways are more instinctively national on many dimensions, but are going to be, I think, much, they're going to be much more dominant in the room. And for example, that could have pretty profound generational implications. We've got some data suggesting that millennials and Generation Z are now more likely to look to the state for answers than to things like individual responsibility. And I wonder what the period effect of this moment is going to be for Generation Z and millennials. My students are trying to find a job, their first job this summer, against the backdrop of not one, but 2 financial crises. And millennials have just seen a decade of recovery from the Great Recession, essentially put into reverse by another crisis. So I think that there's reason to suggest the generational tension may be exacerbated by this, and we need to think about that in a more serious way. And on values, I'm afraid I just don't buy the argument that people's values fundamentally change. I just don't personally think the evidence is there. I think they change in some ways. I think you can see the effect of higher education to some degree, and you can say that over a life cycle, people generally become perhaps a little bit more liberal or mainly a little bit more conservative. But we rarely see a wholesale transformation of people's values. And so I think if you accept that the value divide that we are now living with is also going to be largely permanent, then I think we can learn from some of the work that's being done on how to try and bridge those divides. And rather than just play to our core audience, we could think about, well, how might liberals meet conservatives on some of these issues, and what might that framework look like? An example would be the Labour Party in Britain. The Labour Party currently winning over Remain voters and the university towns doesn't really make any sense if you look at the next election, because the Labour Party already holds 2/3 of those seats. The Labour Party, like many other social democratic parties, now needs to ask itself some tough questions about how it's going to reconnect with socially conservative workers who have just joined Boris Johnson, because without many of those seats in non-London, non-university towns, it can't win the next election. It's just impossible. That's not to say Labour need to start talking up issues like migration and being critical of things like multiculturalism, but it is to say that Labour is going to need a new vocabulary with which it can talk to those voters. And it might be about, for example, thinking through what some progressive thinkers have been suggesting could be a new narrative around what does progressive patriotism look like? What does a progressive case for class solidarity in an era in which people want to talk a bit more about the nation state? What does that look like? How can we readjust to that reality? Some of these questions are somewhat unique to the British experience, but I think the dilemma that the Labour Party is facing is pretty characteristic of the broader dilemma that social democracy is facing. And as Catherine said, in many European party systems, it's much more complicated because you have green parties, you have radical left parties that are making it even harder for centre-left social democrats and progressives to compete. And in some ways, their vote is fragmented. But these are the million-dollar questions, and maybe dignity, respect, and the failings of meritocracy, maybe that's a much more interesting debate to be had.
Great. So these would be then, I would say, also some values that could be put forward in this debate from the side, sort of the supply. I think the question was not so much about like how to change values of people, and particularly not as a political party, but sort of what values to appeal on. I think that's where the question went to. So here we have a question sort of that comes from the audience now, also on this potential for compromise. Maybe it was directed to Matthew, but maybe Catherine, you can start with that, also commenting on what Matthew just said. So the potential for compromise with populist parties, or with you said sort of bridging the divide. Of course, here if we look to several European cases, like in Germany, for example, we can see, and this is here the question, there is a clear self-radicalization of the AfD, for example, over the last year. So the question is really sort of, when dealing with these kind of far-right populist nationalist parties, I think we shouldn't get too much into the labeling debate here. Then, like, with these kind of parties, how do we address them in a way that at the same time keeps the door open for their voters and tries to attract them back to parties that are firmly within the democratic spectrum, while at the same time sort of making clear that they bring issues forward that are not healthy for democracy in the long run. So sort of this tension between reaching out or clearly distancing and then potentially fueling polarization.
So I've been thinking quite a lot about this, and I think that one of the key elements that Matthew also came forward, I also very much agree with. I'm doing some work now on intergenerational solidarity in COVID, right? Old people had to be, older people disproportionately affected by the disease. Younger people had to get a lot of the burden, right? So, and how that will play out in the future, and we don't know yet. We're investigating some of that. But I think that what to me would be key, and that would be for kind of all parties. So I think that many, the way that we think about this in political theory is that we have a social contract, right? So we're not governing ourselves. There's not a struggle, Hobbesian struggle of everyone against everyone, but therefore we have a social construct, and then that social contract, over time included representative democracy, right? So we have these people that are, but to what extent do people feel that that social contract is still fair? Right? A lot of my younger students are really questioning that. Like, that's the kind of okay boomer, right? I mean, you really benefited so much. And also, I think, in quite a level of homogeneous countries where I would agree very much with Matthew that the difficulty in multi-party systems is very strong. If you think about a country like the Netherlands, which was quite homogeneous for quite a long time, much more so than the United Kingdom, by the way, that people feel, well, now there's quote unquote newcomers, which is, I think, the Dutch word for immigrants, but like that's what the Dutch government is using. And, they have not paid into the welfare state. To what extent is that fair, right? If we're thinking about, so these questions about the social contract and how different groups fit in that contract is important. But the other side, I think also is that many other groups that have been out of the social contract for such a long time, think LGBTs, think ethnic minorities, so have the idea, hey, this social contract isn't fair. So the critique is coming from both sides. And I think this is really a crucial thing. And in that way, people are looking at the United States, and that is just some personal note, I'm getting a bit frustrated with a lot of Europeans saying, oh, that's just the US. No, that is a core element about the social contract. It's more extreme in the United States because of the slavery history and so on. But, my country has been very active in the slave trade, as is Matthew's country. And these discussions are also a big part of that. But as is, to what extent are young generations part of a social contract? So I think that in that way, even if we think, I don't know if this will be the kind of era of the big state, at least in terms of spending, right? It is. So maybe it should also be the era of big ideas. So how do we redraft the social contracts that is inclusionary? But that would mean that we also have to tax some people who have really shaved off that social contract, maybe merely by luck, by the age that they have, right? They've worked hard, of course they have, but they might have disproportionately benefited. How do we deal with that? And that's a very, very complex discussions. And I think for fragmented party systems, so that's the generational divide element, right? So that's also, I think, how the EU is trying to, but next generation EU tries to really say the digitalization, the greening is for other generations. We'll see how that plays out. But I think for fragmented multi-party systems, it's really complex. I think what you see is that in the United Kingdom, this gets absorbed in the Conservative Party, and you can have the label on Boris Johnson as you will, but it also goes a little bit more to, it affects government because he's in government, but it goes a little bit more to the center. Whereas what you see in the Netherlands is what you were describing, Anna, also in the Netherlands, that for a new political newcomer to come in, you have to go a bit further every time. So you see a radicalization on the right. Yeah. And how do you then deal with that? So what we show in the book is that actually government formation in continental Europe has slowed down tremendously, and they also are less stable, right? So that's the downside of channeling it through the party system, which is a different way than in the United Kingdom. And then if mainstream parties seem that they can't govern because their governments fall again, and it takes a long time to govern, that fuels back into the kind of populist critique of this managerial class. So I think for fragmented party systems, I personally think that there needs to be some cooperation among groups, because I cannot see that you can solve the collection action problem only in government negotiations, because the problem is it becomes too volatile. So in that way, it was a kind of a thing from the 70s, right? This idea of having a joint lists or something like that. But I think especially in, maybe not in Germany where you have a 5% hurdle, but in countries where you don't have that, where it's really fragmented. I'm thinking Italy, I'm thinking the Netherlands, I'm thinking Denmark, that one would probably have to think a little bit about having coalition accords and having clearer choices in order for that government formation to be smoother, because I think that's the particular element also. So a social contract and generational, really attention to generational divides, and some ways in the course of the practical organization of that, maybe we can develop some kind of accords of progressive parties working together. And then one party might not gain, but the overall agenda will gain, right? So to have that kind of trade-off, I think will be really crucial. I mean, that kind of comes from my research and could help. But I very much agree with Matthew's point about the generational divide. And I would like to add that that's, I think, a core question about the social contract we have and if it's fair and working for everyone.
Right. No, that's a very good point, and we have here also a quite interesting comment from the audience on this issue. He or she writes that the claim that progressives have made a mistake by taking radical positions on human rights was destroyed in the US case 2 days ago by the decisive 6-3 Supreme Court decision banning discrimination against LGBTQ people. The question here, so how can one criticize sort of the strategy of emphasizing these issues when they actually lead to a political victory? I think that's quite an interesting point, sort of in response to parts of what Matthew said before. And then there's another question. Maybe Matthew, you can take these two together. Another question linking a bit more to the COVID-19 response. So here a question from the audience that sort of the worst policy failings on COVID-19 were countries with highly populist leaders. We heard you here that you wouldn't classify Johnson as a populist leader, but still these three countries, the US, the UK, and Brazil, do we think that they will be punished at the polls, especially given the emergence of leaders now like Biden and Starmer who are trying at least to appeal more to traditional working class voters?
Well, I think on the management of the crisis, personally, I think the picture is a lot more complex than the question would have us believe. That I mean, if you look at cases and deaths per capita, then the picture is not the assumed correlation with political the political regime or the type of politics that's in control and the management of the crisis is a lot more complicated. But on the underlying question of competence, but probably we don't know. My instinct is that populists are not judged in the same way when it comes to performance management as mainstream parties, because their support is anchored quite strongly in a desire to have voice. And when voters feel that their voice is represented, within the corridors of power, particularly working class voters and non-graduates, they may be willing to overlook performance management in order to prioritize that sense of voice. But the other sort of reality, the kind of elephant in the room here as well, is that it's not as if progressive parties were doing amazingly well when they were in office on a whole suite of issues. And many voters, we talk about voters having retrospective evaluations of how the economy was run. I mean, voters also think more generally about the society in which they're living and the decisions that were taken that led to certain outcomes. So if, for example, you live outside of the big cities and you're in small towns or you're in rural communities, take where I'm living in the UK, for example, you had pretty good reason to want to overthrow the status quo because your area had received consistently much less investment than other areas over 30, 40 years. And that happened largely under New Labour, happened under 13 years of centre-left government. It also happened previously under Margaret Thatcher and the Conservatives. And we had a convergence of the two main parties that had clearly also planted the seeds of many of the grievances that would then find their expression through populism and through the vote to leave the European Union. And yes, there have been very important triumphs along the way. I think obviously the social changes relating to LGBT rights and same-sex marriage and all of those issues, part of what you might call the second big liberal revolution after the 1960s, and have been embraced by conservatives as well as liberals. I don't think anybody is questioning any of that. But on a whole suite of other issues, my feeling at least is that there's not been sufficient reflection about where the settlement has gone wrong and why it's gone wrong and how we can better address it. Because on issues like inequality, regional imbalance, workers' share of national income, and representation, just representation in terms of, are these groups represented not just in politics, but in media, in the arts, on television, all of these dimensions of power, right? In terms of cultural capital, Are these groups represented within our national conversation? They're not.
Yeah.
And then we sort of have a conversation around why are these voters feeling so disillusioned and angry when every time they turn on the television or read the comment pages in newspapers, they're constantly seeing the same groups shaping and molding the opinion that Catherine points out is so important. And what I think personally underpins these debates sometimes is a suspicion, is a suspicion of majoritarian democracy. And I think voters have picked up on that. And I think voters have acknowledged that. I think they can see that. And I think that's partly why, unfortunately, we've got into this position where now populists feel as though, they have a fairly steady, durable audience. Because even when these big shocks have arrived, like Brexit, like Trump, have we really responded as well as we could have done to Donald Trump? Right? Have we really responded as well as we could have done to Brexit? I don't think we have. I think the conversation's been quite inadequate, actually. We've become obsessed with these kind of evil figures behind the corridors of power, Dominic Cummings, Steve Bannon. We've talked about Cambridge Analytica. What we should, I think, have done is had a good 2, 3, 4 year debate setting out radical alternative proposals for addressing the moral outrage and saying xenophobia and racism are completely unacceptable. This isn't going to be engaged with. But here's our plan for the swing states. Here's our plan for Northern England, right? Here's our plan for whatever it is in other examples in Europe. Maybe I've been reading the wrong newspapers, but I just haven't seen much of that, Anna. Maybe we could learn from those two moments and whether we did reply to them as well as we could have done.
Yeah, this was almost a great closing statement where we're coming to the end of the panel now. We have a few minutes left, but I'd like to sort of ask both of you now for some closing remarks, mainly on this question now. So really so what should progressives do? And I would like to add 2 questions from the audience into this. First of all, there was a question on whether European governments should or the EU should condemn or even sanction countries like Poland, Hungary more due to their rise of illiberalism in those countries. I mean, that's a big question, but maybe a brief answer here. The other question that we got is maybe even more important, which I'm just going to read out in full because I think it's so important. The question is, can the panel help me as the ordinary human on the street to suggest what action I can take as an individual to tackle influence nationalism and illiberal populism? Maybe Catherine, you go first, 2 minutes, and then the final 2 minutes for Alexis.
So I just wanted to say that I very much agree that we have to take a stock at what happened, but I also I think one key element that has been lost about the Trump vote and the Brexit vote is that they could have easily gone the other way. So there's also a huge kind of, and that comes back to the kind of idea of that, a lot of the things that progressives have fought for have also mainstreamed. I just don't understand why no one is claiming that. So that's a little bit what I wanted to say on that. When it comes to European governments, I think it's crucial. So as an EU scholar, I understand why the Commission doesn't want to do what it wants to do because it cannot get a recovery fund while also opening up the kind of east-west flank, right? But clearly, I mean, we have a autocracy in our midst, right? At the time that Orban, and it has been going on for a long time. And also mainstream politicians, sorry, I'm not going to mention specifically a German, Manfred Weber, have been totally complicit to letting this happen. So it's really important, and this comes back to the issue, what I said, that it is also, we have to have an idea, it's not just about talking if Ivanka Trump is complicit. It's about talking about how we've been complicit as continental Europeans about having a country in our midst that has now really gotten rid of press freedom, of basically democracy, and that's really crucial. So then what can you as a person do, right? So I think that I very much agree with what was said before in terms of that we have to start talking to each other so that the idea of polarization out, I try to follow different people on Twitter, try to get different approaches, try to not only, why do people think that way? So I thought what was really crucial is some of the images that came out of the United States, where an African-American woman, I can now remember, she's a writer, I forgot her name, at a certain point say, imagine how it feels like that you get looted every day, that the system works against you every day. I think that I come from a very rural area in the Netherlands, and many of my family members have the idea that the system isn't working for them. So I think that we have to start with understanding, but then also within those discussions, when I try to understand, I am very clear where I stand. And I try to explain to them why I see it differently. That I want, just like them, to renew the social contract, but I don't want to renew the social contract excluding people. I would like to include people who feel very similar to them, right? And the way is how are we going to do that? So I think one thing is to be clear about what you stand, but not to be like, not to kind of stop talking and being in your own silo. I think that's what we really need to stop talking about.
All right, great. Matthew, 1 minute left maybe on this final question. What would you recommend to the person on the street?
Well, I would echo the point about following very different views. We do have some disturbing evidence coming through social science that if you compare liberals and conservatives, liberals are more likely to unfriend people who hold ideological views that they disagree with. I wouldn't want to exaggerate the significance of that, but I'm concerned that it points to a problem, a tendency to shut down when somebody presents that other view. And I think the best way of countering that, obviously, is to engage and debate and follow people and listen and discuss with those who hold different views. Because, as I say, I'm very influenced by the work of John Haidt in the United States, very influenced by the work of Ezra Klein as well, people who are actually asking the real questions about if we're entering into this period of polarization that's underpinned by a change in the structures of politics, where values are going to become more important. The only question that we need to be thinking about really is how are we actually going to try and compromise in the middle in this polarized era. The idea that you can just kind of keep going and everything in society is going to go your way and these groups are going to grow and these groups are going to diminish and everything's going to be okay. The kind of linear interpretation of history that has often accompanied progressive thought has time and time again, I would argue, been overtaken by events. And so the plea and the point that I would like to make is let's just keep that word compromise at the foreground.
Great. Thanks so much. This was a great debate. I learned a lot. I hope you in the audience as well. Thank you for being with us. And I wish you all a great rest of the conference. And thanks to the organizers again.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Matthew. Bye.
Thanks everybody for coming.